Hi, it's Richard here from Intelligent Advisor IT Consulting with the next chapter in our online training about decision services. Let's look at the agenda. In this chapter, we're going to talk about objects. Now, we've been talking about objects almost since the very beginning. We've briefly referenced them when we were talking about the REST API. We've talked about them when we were using live mode. And we've briefly covered some of their features right at the very beginning when we looked at differences between Oracle Policy Modeling and decision services. Now we're going to look at the practical side of things. How do we write rules for objects? How do we define input and output objects? And how do we use them in the debugger? At the end of this, there will be a demonstration showing each of these. First of all, what is an object? An object is not an entity, even though it is similar in many ways to an entity. In fact, as you'll learn in later chapters, it can be mapped to an entity. Objects are defined, just like fields, as part of the input or output contract of your decision service. In decision services, there is no notion of a relationship. You do not define a relationship, nor do you have a relationship that is created for you, such as you would see in Oracle Policy Modeling. At a basic level, if you have created an input contract, such as the screenshot you can see, which has an object called the person and a field called the person's date of birth, then your decision service is expecting the calling application, you or Postman or somebody, to provide instances of the person object, each of which will have a person's date of birth in the input. If you intend to output the same object, for example, you intend to output the person, but you're going to calculate their age, then you're going to need an output object referencing the person and the age as an output field. So if you're planning on doing this, you will need two objects, one in each part of the contract. Objects can be nested, as in this case you can see that I have the person and the person's cards. There is no notion of cardinality. You cannot define a relationship as being many to many, one to many, many to one, and so forth. All object relationships are hierarchical. One person can have many cars. There can be many persons, but each person can have many cars. So let's focus again on input objects. You've defined a contract that says there's an input object called the person, and each person has a date of birth. This is your input object with its input field. Then, in your decision service, you're going to need at least one block to be able to manipulate that input object's instances. For example, in the screenshot you can see here, I've created a block that calculates the person's age using a familiar year difference function. Notice the black bar at the top of the screenshot. It says calculated for each of the person with a small triangle. The triangle allows the rule designer to set the scope of this block. By setting the scope to the person, the decision service expects the rules inside the block to have a scope of the person. You'll notice the second rule is a calculation using instance count. That's because in a block with a scope of the person, you can also reference child object instances of the person. So in this case, I am counting the number of persons' cars. For those of you who are familiar with the concept of scope in Word, for example, using for scope or for all scope, or indeed simply writing rules to ensure that you have the correct scope, then this should be quite familiar. Output objects if you need to infer an output object from scratch in your rules, then you can use a special rule construct called an object block. When you add it, there will be a single line that says items equals, and I have replaced it in this case, you can see, with the hazardous wastes equals. And it's followed by a table. The table is an inference table. In this case, you can see it's a table with 2 result columns and no condition columns. So the result of this block will be, I will instantiate 6 different hazardous wastes when I run my decision service. For those of you who are familiar with, for example, an inference table in Excel, this should be very familiar. If you're going to use one of these special object blocks to infer output object instances, then you'll need to have at least one result column. And of course, in my example, I didn't have any condition columns, but I could condition the inference. And you'd expect to have at least one or more rows, where each row represents a record that you're planning to instance. And as I just showed you in the screenshot, hazardous wastes, one of the example decision services, which I talked about in the previous chapter, is a good example of how to instantiate a set of output object instances from an object block. In live mode and run as rest mode, if you have created an input object and some input object fields, then you will be required to add the necessary field values to generate your output. In this screenshot, on the left-hand side, you can see there is an entity whose technical name, you can see there is an object whose technical name is the person. I have created 2 instances of the person, each with a different date of birth. On the right-hand side, you can see that the 2 instances of the person have each 1 car and have a variety of attributes. One has an age of 51 and the other one is 0 years old. One can purchase alcohol and one cannot. At the same time, above the persons, you can see in the green section of the output that there are a couple of top-level fields that have also been generated. Each rule block can only contain rules for one scope, meaning you can't change scope halfway through. So each block requires your attention to make sure that you've selected the correct scope. The top level scope is called the case, and you can change the scope using the drop down. Be aware that changing the scope is likely to cause a bunch of red errors to appear because references to fields or object fields may no longer resolve correctly because you've changed the context, you've changed the scope. Just a final reminder, if an object scope is set for a block, then all of the parent and other fields are also in scope. So in the case of a person's cars, you can count the person's cars while you're in a person block. In the screenshot, you can see that I have one block listed as per case, which counts the number of persons, and the topmost block is calculated for each of the persons and will generate a number of health warnings as an output object. And this time I have included 2 condition columns. So what have we seen in this short chapter? We've begun to see that objects are not entities. They behave in similar ways, but they have different ways of being built, different definitions, and different terminology. We've seen that you can use them in inputs and outputs, and that in the live mode or the run via rest, you're required to enter the instances by hand. Perhaps the single biggest challenge for newcomers is the concept of scope. Understanding that if you write a rule in a block that has the wrong scope, you will get an error, just like you would have done in Oracle Policy Modeling, but perhaps we're less used to it in decision services. So now we're going to look at a demonstration of each of those elements. So in our demonstration for the chapter about objects and object blocks, we're going to look at two different services. The first one is one of the services provided as an example in the documentation. It's called hazardous wastes. Hazardous wastes is an adaptation of a service, is an adaptation of an example project, which you may be familiar with. In this particular case, the service, you will notice, has no input. The sole job of this service is to create output, and the output takes the form of an output object called the hazardous wastes. And the hazardous wastes contain two fields, the hazardous waste level and the waste name. In the rule editor, we can see there is one block. That block is an object block. We can always tell it's an object block because of the distinct formatting and structure of the data at the beginning of the table. The hazardous wastes equals is basically generating the object instances. There are no condition columns, therefore these hazardous wastes will be generated systematically. Let's take a look at a second example. In this decision service, you can see we have an input representing the persons, and we have a person's name and a person's date of birth. We also have the date of the interview. In the output, we have an output object called the persons. We have the person's name, we have the person's age, and whether they can buy drugs and alcohol. So the same concept in input and output, but it is two separate object definitions. As we can see, there are a number of blocks. First of all, there is a block per case, where we will calculate the total number of people using instance count to reference the persons. Then we have a calculation of the person's age, so the block must be for each of the persons. You'll notice the three options are once per case, once per each of the persons, and once per each of the health warnings. As we're about to see, there is a child object of the person. For each of the persons, there is a table using a range of values for the person's age and setting as result columns some booleans. Finally, for each of the persons, we are going to instantiate a child object called the person's health warnings. So I can see that the person's health warnings is an object block because of this unique syntax, and I can see that I will infer a number of health warnings depending on whether the person can buy alcohol, drugs, or both. In the output, we will see the persons, we will see whether they can buy drugs, their age, and their alcohol, and their name. Let's go into live mode to see how that works. So in live mode, of course, I'll need to begin by entering the required information, such as the date of the interview. So I'll put today's date. Next, I will need to add at least one instance of my input object. So I'm going to create 3 persons. Each one of them has an error for the moment because they have a required field, which is their date of birth. So I'm going to enter the date of birth for the first person and give that person a name. Actually, I did the third one first, so I'll go backwards. And I'll finish off with the last one. So I have entered the required inputs for my 3 object instances. In the output, I have 3 persons being output. I have 1, 2, 3 different persons, and I have 3 different sets of output. So let's take a look at the different persons. You'll recall from the chapter on live mode that I can select to see all records or one of the records. So, for example, I can see that person number 1, the person's age is 12 years. Since the person can buy neither drugs nor alcohol, there will be no person's health warnings. Person number 2, on the other hand, will generate 3 records in the person's health warnings. Similarly for person number 3. And as I scroll through the output, I can view the values of the output object fields. At the same time, in the top level object, I can see the top level field called the total number of people. Now we will complete the output contract by adding a reference to the child object, the person's health warnings. I'll switch back to edit mode. I'll make sure I'm on the output tab, and I'll make sure that I'm in the right context. So I'll select the persons and click the plus and add an object list, which will be added as a child object list. I'm going to give this a name and reference the text for the object block, the person's health warnings. So you'll see that I now have an object which is a child of the parent of the person. I can now go ahead and add 2 attributes. Representing the health warning text and the health warning description to my output contract. When I now switch into live mode, for each person, person number 1 has no records in the person's health warnings. Person number 2 has 3 records, as does number 3. And when I expand it, I can read the text and description of each health warning. That concludes our demonstration of using object blocks in rules. See you in the next chapter.